Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with Taddy Noy. If you're just joining us or returning after a break, we've been walking through the story of Exodus, Israel's dramatic departure from slavery in Egypt and their journey towards becoming a covenant people. In the last chapter, we began exploring what scholars call the Book of the Covenant, a collection of laws given right after the Ten Commandments. These laws form the foundation of Israel's civil and social life. They're practical, ethical, and deeply cultural. Today, in Exodus 22, we'll continue that journey looking at property laws, social justice, and God's deep concern for the vulnerable. So let's read it together. Exodus 22 from the NIV version. Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise and the defender is guilty of bloodshed, anyone who steals must certainly make restitution, but if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay their theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, they must pay back double. If anyone grazes their livestock in a field or a vineyard and lets them stray and they graze in someone else's field, the offender must make restitution from the best of their own field or vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes so that it burns shocks of grain or standing grain or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. If anyone gives a neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping and they're stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges, and they must determine whether the owner has laid hands on the other person's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which somebody says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before judges. The one who the judges declare guilty must pay back double to the other. If anyone gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to their neighbor for safekeeping and it dies, or is injured, or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. But if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, restitution must be made to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the neighbor shall bring in the remains as evidence and shall not be required to pay for the torn animal. If anyone borrows an animal from their neighbor and it is injured or dies while the other is not present, they must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must pay the bride price for the virgins. Do not allow a sorceress to live. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal is to be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, they will cry out to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor may have. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from granaries or your vats. You must give the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th. You are to be my holy people, so do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it to the dogs. Deep dive, Exodus 22. Exodus 22 is a part of what scholars call the Covenant Code, a block of legal material spanning Exodus 20:22 through 23:33. These chapters provide early case law for Israel as a newly formed nation, and laws here function like building blocks of a society. They do not exist in a vacuum. Each one is rooted in real-world experience, cultural assumptions, and theological conviction. And in Exodus 22, we get a clearer picture of what justice, mercy, and holiness look like in ancient Israelite society. Let's begin by addressing the theme of restitution, which dominates the first part of the chapter. Unlike modern Western legal systems that often focus on punishment or incarceration, ancient Israel prioritized restoration. The laws governing theft, property damage, and borrowing in verses 1 through 15 reflect this principle. If someone stole livestock or sold or killed it, they were required to repay multiple animals in return. 5 oxen for an ox, 4 sheep for a sheep in verse 1. This ratio seems deliberate. Oxen were more valuable, used for plowing and economic productivity, so the penalty was harsher. But if the stolen animal was recovered alive, only double restitution was required. This reflects both the crime's severity and the capacity for restoration. The cultural context here is agricultural and communal. In a society where survival depended on land, flocks, and shared trust, theft wasn't just a loss of theft. It wasn't just a loss of goods. It was a rupture of community trust. That's why restitution rather than in prison was the preferred model. It restored balance while allowing the offender to remain in the community. In verse 2, we find an intriguing distinction. If a thief is killed during a night break-in, the homeowner is not guilty. But if the thief is killed during the day, the owner is guilty of bloodshed. Why? Because at night there's uncertainty. The homeowner may fear for their life, but during the day there's enough clarity to potentially subdue the thief without killing them. These kinds of legal nuances are rare in ancient Near Eastern codes, but here we see a moral balance between self-defense and the sanctity of life. Next, in verses 5 through 6, addresses indirect harm. Someone's animal grazes on another's field, or a fire spreads from one property to another. These were everyday problems in rural agrarian life. The law here demands restitution, but again, it does so in a way that respects communal life. Even when harm is accidental, responsibility must be taken. The idea is to maintain peace between neighbors. In verses 7 through 13 deal with the cases involving safekeeping and trust, what scholars call bailment laws. If someone leaves goods with a neighbor or those goods are stolen and the thief is not found, then an oath before the judges settles the matter. This oath system assumes that oaths made before Yahweh are serious enough that false testimony would invite divine judgment. Ancient Israel did not have modern forensic tools. Instead, they built accountability into their spiritual framework. So now let's move to the moral and ethical codes of verses 16 through 31. This section deals with societal boundaries, sexuality, foreign worship, and the care of the vulnerable. In verse 16, we see laws concerning sexual relations with a virgin not yet pledged in marriage. This wasn't merely about personal sin. It had implications for family honor, inheritance, and social structure. The man had to pay the bride price, a mohar in Hebrew, a symbolic and financial gesture of commitment. Even if the woman's father refused to give her in marriage, the mohar was still required. This system, while patriarchal by modern standards, functioned to protect women from being discarded after such an act and to preserve their dignity and status. Verse 18 shifts dramatically. Do not allow a sorceress to live. This stark commandment reflects a cultural fear of magic and divination that was common in the ancient world. Sorcery was not simply an act of rebellion against God. It was a power play in a highly spiritual culture. A sorceress claimed access to secret powers outside the covenant with Yahweh. In Israel's eyes, this fractured the spiritual integrity of the community and invited danger. Similarly, verses 19's prohibition against bestiality and verse 20's warning against sacrificing to other gods reflects radical monotheism. These laws draw clear boundaries between Yahweh's worship and the rituals of surrounding cultures. The ancient Canaanites, Egyptians, and Mesopotamians had practices that Israelite was called to reject, practices that blurred moral and religious lines. But when the tone changes, but then the tone changes again, and here we encounter one of the most moving sections of the covenant code, verses 21 through 27, which focus on the treatment of foreigners, widows, orphans, and the poor. The verses offer insight into God's heart. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, God says, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Verse 21. This is empathy-based ethics, a rare and powerful concept in ancient legal codes. Israel's own suffering becomes the reason they must now show compassion. God ties justice not to social status or nationality, but to memory and shared humanity. In verses 22 through 24 are even more intense. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear. God pledges personal vengeance on behalf of the vulnerable. This is astonishing. In most ancient cultures, widows and orphans were seen as liabilities. Here they are at the center of divine concern. God's anger is described as aroused on their behalf, suggesting his justice is not only legal, it's emotional. Verse 25 prohibits charging interest when lending to the poor. This isn't about business loans, it's about survival. In ancient economies, the poor often borrowed to eat. Charging interest in such situations would entrench them further in poverty. By forbidding interest, the law seeks to restore rather than exploit. This is economic justice with mercy at its core. In verses 26 through 27, deepen this ethic. If a poor person gives their cloak as collateral, it must be returned by nightfall. Why? Because that cloak might be their only covering. When they cry out to me, God says, I will hear, for I am a compassion. The Hebrew word for compassionate here is rachum, a term deeply associated with God's character and often tied to parental tenderness. It reflects not only God's justice, but his warmth. Now we arrive at verses 28 through 31, which cover reverence for God, respect for leadership, and consecration of firstborns, both animal and human. In ancient Israel, the firstborn represented the strength and future of the family. Offering the firstborn to God was a symbolic way of saying, all that I have is from you and belongs to you. It echoes the Passover theme that will emerge more fully in the next chapter. Verse 31 ends with an odd but meaningful instruction. Do not eat the meat, Do not eat the meat from an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it to the dogs. This reflects a concern for ritual cleanliness and cultural identity. God's people were to live differently, even in what they ate. The Hebrew word for holy here is kadosh, which means set apart. These boundaries created a rhythm of daily life that consistently reminded Israel of their unique relationship to God. And now for some final reflections. This chapter may look like a list of ancient rules, but when we read it carefully, we hear something more. It's the heartbeat of God who cares about both justice and mercy. Every law here reflects something about the culture Israel was coming from and the culture God wanted them to build. It shows us a God who sees not only kings and priests, but the thief, the borrower, and the widow and the foreigner. What stands out to me is how many of these laws assume empathy. God doesn't just say, obey me. He says, remember where you came from. He says, return the cloak because that person is cold. There are small daily choices that reveal big theological truths. That holiness isn't just about worship. It's about how we treat the least among us. If you're still with me, thank you so much. I hope something here resonated. Maybe it was the cultural insight or a moment where the character of God became clearer. Maybe you saw something new in a passage you've read many times. If so, I would love to hear it. Drop your thoughts, questions, or personal insights in the comments below. Let's keep learning together. I have gotten some really wonderful comments in the past that I didn't, that were new to me. So thank you again. You're teaching me as well. Thanks again for walking this journey with me. May your own heart remain tender to justice, quick to show compassion, and always hungry to know God more deeply through His Word and through the world He loves. See you in the next chapter tomorrow.